They will tell you it was custom, a harmless tradition of survival in the mountains. But when you peel back the layers of silence, you find something colder, something calculated. Picture this: 3 brothers bound not just by blood, but by a pact that defied the very fabric of what we call morality. One wife shared between them, her body and her life turned into property, not by chance, but by design. The justification was simple, or so they claimed, so that land, wealth, and inheritance would never fragment, so that the family's fortune would remain intact, unbroken by division. But behind that reasoning lurked a truth no one dared to speak aloud: the erasure of individuality, the annihilation of a woman's freedom, and the binding of 3 men into a web of jealousy, rivalry, and control. In the villages where whispers of this family spread, they called it efficiency, but in the dark it felt like imprisonment. This was not marriage in any sense. You and I know it was a ritual of possession, crafted under the pretense of survival, but executed as domination. The wife, nameless in records, faceless in history, became both the anchor and the prisoner of a structure built by men to preserve themselves at any cost. Think about the psychology of this arrangement. 3 brothers, growing up together, sharing meals, blood, secret sand. Then, when the time comes, sharing a wife. What happens in the quiet moments when envy festers? What happens when one brother longs for exclusivity, but duty chains him to silence? What happens when the wife, forced to belong to all, secretly dreams of belonging to none? This is where the darkness begins, because systems like these were not rare accidents. They were upheld by tradition, law, and silence, ensuring that no one could question them without being exiled. And yet, buried in the folds of history, are hints that such marriages carried curses: children born into confusion of paternity, inheritances soaked in dispute, brothers turning on one another in brutal conflicts. The wealth remained whole, but the family did not. This is the story you were never supposed to hear, because it reveals how survival cloaked itself in cruelty, and how silence turned crimes into customs. Tonight, we open the locked door on the tale of 3 brothers, 1 wife, and a secret that still casts shadows across time. The setting was remote, the kind of place where mountains rise like walls against the sky and winters bite so deep that families learned long ago to fear division more than hunger. In such a world, land was not just dirt, it was survival, identity, and power. The 3 brothers, sons of a stern patriarch, had been taught from childhood that property could not be split. To divide the soil was to invite ruin. Their father whispered it like a curse: brothers who separate will wither, families who divide will starve. And so the pact was made before they even understood its weight. The eldest, strong and calculating, accepted the arrangement as duty. The second, quieter but resentful, swallowed his shame beneath obedience. The youngest, barely a man, trembled, with both fear and desire at what was being forced upon him. The wife was chosen not for love, but for strategy. She was young, from a family whose silence was easily purchased, and her union with the brothers was presented as an honor. Villagers smiled at the ceremony, muttering blessings, but behind closed doors they whispered of curses. Some said such families always ended in blood. Yet no one interfered, because tradition held more power than justice. The first night in that house was not celebration, it was conquest. Imagine her terror, her vows binding her not to 1 protector, but to 3. Men, each with claims to her body, each with rights sanctioned by a culture that left no escape. Over time, the walls of that home absorbed more than silence. They absorbed rivalry. Brothers who once shared toys and laughter now watched each other with suspicion, their eyes flicking toward the woman as though she were the measure of their worth. She bore children, but whose they were was a question no one dared to ask aloud. Lineage blurred, and with it, the sacred idea of inheritance they fought so hard to protect. In preserving their fortune, they had poisoned their bloodline, and as whispers grew in the village, darker tales spread rumors of violent quarrels in the night, of one brother found beaten, of the wife seen wandering the fields with hollow eyes, clutching secrets no one dared pry from her lips. What began as tradition had become a slow descent into madness, binding all four of them into a prison with no doors in the daylight. The house looked ordinary, a wooden structure perched against the slopes, smoke curling from its chimney, livestock grazing in its yard. But if you looked closely, you would see the fractures in its foundation, not of stone, but of spirit. The brothers moved like shadows around each other, polite in front of outsiders. But inside the walls, every glance carried accusation. The wife became the silent battlefield. She cooked for them, bore their children, and shared their bed in rotations decided by unspoken agreements. But no arrangement could erase the truth. Desire is not something that can be divided equally. The eldest treated her as possession, a symbol of the family's strength. The second searched her eyes for affection, never certain if it was meant for him or his brother. The youngest burned with restless passion, torn between guilt and hunger. And she, caught in the center, learned the art of silence, the art of concealing which touch she feared, which touch she craved. Over time, the villagers began to sense something unnatural in the air around that home. They noticed how rarely the brothers spoke freely, how the wife's laughter never rang in the fields, how the children never resembled one man more than another. Rumors began to swell that she had taken sides, that one brother claimed more of her love than the rest. This was the unspoken danger of polyandry, jealousy that could not be acknowledged, because acknowledgement meant shattering the very reason the marriage existed, so instead it rotted in secret. At night, arguments turned to shouts, shouts to fists, and sometimes to silence that stretched too long. There were stories told of a knife embedded in the wooden table, of blood dripping on the floor one winter evening, of neighbors hearing screams carried on the wind and yet no one daring to step inside. For in such villages, tradition was untouchable. To interfere was to question the system, to defy the ancestors. And so the family spiraled deeper into a cage built by their own obedience. The wealth was preserved. The land remained whole, but the souls within those walls decayed. What was presented as clever survival was in truth a form of slow execution, not just of one woman's freedom, but of three men's brotherhood. In preserving what was theirs, they lost themselves, and the villagers, they only whispered, because to speak the truth was to invite the same curse. Power in such households was never truly shared. Though the brothers carried equal rights to the wife, equality was a myth told to keep the system intact. The eldest, hardened by years of being groomed for authority, carried himself like a ruler. He dictated when fields would be tilled, when animals would be sold, and even when the wife would belong to him. The second brother, quiet and observant, carried the resentment of always standing in another man's shadow. And the youngest, wild, reckless, had no authority at all, except in the privacy of desire, where boundaries blurred. The wife understood this imbalance better than anyone. She was the prize in their silent war, the object of their control, yet also the instrument of their collapse. To survive, she played roles, adjusting herself to each man's hunger, concealing her own. But survival leaves scars. Neighbors recalled how her face grew pale over the years, how she rarely looked anyone in the eyes, as if carrying shame that was never her own. The children she bore were raised under suspicion, each child a question mark in blood. The eldest claimed the firstborn as his, declaring the boy the rightful heir to their wealth. But whispers said the second brother was the true father. The second-born was claimed by the younger brother, yet villagers pointed out features that tied him to the eldest. By the time the third child came, no one even speculated lineage had become meaningless. The land, the wealth, the reason for their pact was preserved in writing, but in flesh it was chaos. And it was in this chaos that violence grew. Accounts tell of bitter disputes during harvests, when exhaustion stripped away civility. Some nights, fists flew and knives were drawn, not against outsiders, but brother against brother. Still, no one reported it. The law turned its eyes away, because to acknowledge the truth of these marriages was to admit that custom itself could be a cage. Institutions protected the silence. Elders reinforced the practice, and priests blessed it, calling it the will of ancestors. Yet beneath the blessings, the family was rotting. The wife, once a daughter, then a bride, had become a ghost walking among the living, and the brothers, sworn to protect each other, had become predators circling the same prey. Their bond shattered by a system that demanded unity but delivered destruction. It was during one particularly harsh winter that the cracks became impossible to ignore. Snow sealed the valley in silence, cutting the family off from neighbors for weeks. Inside the house, the fire burned low, and so did patience. Hunger gnawed, not just at their bodies but at their sanity. The eldest, accustomed to obedience, began tightening his grip. He declared that the wife would belong to him during the long nights of cold, arguing that, as head of the household, it was his right. The second brother resisted quietly at first, but resentment spilled into open defiance when he saw her weeping. In the corner, her face lit by the glow of dying embers. The youngest, intoxicated by his passions, lashed out, insisting she was not property to be rationed like food. That night, the storm outside mirrored the storm within. Accounts whispered through the village tell of screams carried across the frozen air, of wood splintering, of the wife's voice breaking as three men battled for dominance over her and over themselves. When the snow thawed and neighbors ventured close, they found the family silent. Bruises hidden beneath clothing, a knife scar gouged deep into the wooden floor by the hearth. None spoke of it, but everyone knew. The wife's eyes told the truth. No words could capture. In them was not just sorrow, but something darker, resignation, as though she understood that her life had become a ritual of endurance rather than living. The children too had changed. They stopped playing in the fields. They flinched at sudden noises. Their laughter vanished, and the villagers, bound by the iron grip of tradition, looked away. To question the marriage was to question their own. Heralded their own fathers and grandfathers who had walked the same path, so they cloaked their fear in silence. But silence does not erase, it corrodes. Rumor spread of nights when the wife slipped into the fields, staring at the stars with hands trembling, whispering prayers to gods who never answered. Some said she sought escape, others said she sought death. Whatever truth lingered, it was clear the pact of preservation had become a curse. The family wealth was intact, the land untouched, but inside those walls, something had already died. It was only a matter of time before blood, real blood, stained the soil they had fought so hard to protect. As seasons passed, the village began to notice more than silence it, noticed fear. The wife no longer walked alone. One of the brothers always trailed behind her, as if guarding her, but in truth, as if watching her. Possession had twisted into paranoia. The eldest, drunk on control, suspected the second of conspiring against him. The second, embittered by humiliation, whispered to the youngest about rebellion, and the youngest, lost between loyalty and lust, began to believe the wife truly belonged to him. The lines blurred until brotherhood itself was poisoned. One evening, during harvest celebrations, the cracks burst into the open. Villagers recalled the brothers drinking heavily, their laughter strained, their eyes hollow. When the wife appeared, carrying a jug of water, the youngest placed his hand on hers, too long, too boldly. The eldest struck him across the face in front of everyone. The second rose to defend the youngest, accusing the eldest of tyranny. For the first time, what was usually hidden behind closed doors spilled into the public. The festival ended in uneasy silence. After that night, whispers turned into warnings. Neighbors began telling their children to keep away from that house, claiming spirits lingered there, restless from sins unspoken. Some said the land itself was cursed, that no harvest from it would ever satisfy the hunger it had bred. The wife became more withdrawn. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words seemed fragmented, as if she was slowly unraveling. Yet, strangely, she remained. Some argued it was duty, others whispered it was fear. But a darker theory circulated. She believed escape was impossible, that even death would not free her, because tradition bound souls as tightly as flesh. The children grew in this tension, inheriting confusion as their legacy. No one knew which brother they truly belonged to, and so no brother truly claimed them. They became shadows, half sons and half fares, suspended in a lineage, to tangled, to hold, and all the while, the system held firm. Elders defended the marriage as necessity, priests cloaked it in sacredness, and law refused to interfere. Institutions that should have protected became guardians of silence. That is the power of hidden systems. They do not need force when obedience is carved into the bones of those who suffer. But every system that consumes its people eventually faces collapse. And in this house, collapse was no longer a question of if but, when by the 7th year of their union, the house was less a home than a battlefield disguised in routine. The wife moved mechanically, tending to fields, animals, and children with the expressionless face of someone who had surrendered all sense of self. Yet beneath her silence was a storm, a knowledge that no one would ever ask her what she wanted. Because in this system, what she wanted did not matter. The eldest brother now carried himself like a patriarch, issuing commands not only to his siblings, but to the wife, who was expected to obey without hesitation. The second had grown bitter, his once quiet nature hardened into suspicion. He watched, the eldest with burning eyes, resenting the authority he could never fully challenge. The youngest, reckless and impatient, whispered promises to the wife in secret promises of love, of escape, of a life beyond these cursed walls. But promises whispered in the dark have a way of festering into destruction. One night, the youngest acted. When the eldest claimed the wife as his, the youngest forced his way in, demanding his share, declaring that she was not just property, but his beloved. The argument turned violent. Fists struck flesh, and the wife was caught between them, pulled, torn, her body the battlefield of their rage. The second brother intervened, but not to save her. He chose sides, hurling himself at the eldest, years of resentment erupting all at once. That night, the house nearly collapsed under the weight of their fury. The wife fled into the cold fields, her cries echoing through the night, neighbors later claiming they heard her scream words not in prayer but in defiance. When she returned at dawn, her clothes were torn, her face streaked with dirt and tears, and in her hands she carried a small blade. Some say she had gone to the river to throw herself in, but stopped at the edge, staring at the freezing water, until her rage burned hotter than her despair. Others believe she sharpened the blade, her thoughts circling vengeance. Whatever the truth, she returned not as the broken figure they had known, but as someone changed. The brothers saw it too. Something in her eyes had hardened, something dangerous, something that promised she would not remain silent forever. And in that moment, they all knew what was once a pact of survival had turned into a curse that none of them could control. The wife's silence had once been their shield, the guarantee that their secret war would remain hidden. But after that night, her silence became a weapon. She stopped answering to the eldest's commands, turning her head away when he barked orders. She ignored the second's suspicious questions, refusing to reassure him with the scraps of attention he craved. And to the youngest, she gave nothing, not even the faintest smile, to remind him of those whispered promises. The balance of power shifted, and in their desperation, the brothers turned against one another with sharper intensity. The eldest insisted on reinforcing order. He claimed the wife was his, not by love, but by right, reminding his brothers that tradition was on his side. The second seethed, reminding him that without his labor, without his silent endurance, the family's wealth would have crumbled years ago. The youngest sneered at both, declaring he had her heart and what was custom compared to passion. Their arguments echoed through the valley, neighbors overhearing fragments but refusing to intervene. For the villagers, this family had become a cautionary tale whispered to children, proof of what happens when tradition festers into corruption. And yet, still, no one dared step inside. The children felt the collapse most of all. They huddled together in corners, terrified of their father's shouts, never knowing whose embrace was truly safe. Some nights they cried for their mother, but she no longer soothed them, her eyes fixed on some distant point, as if she were already planning her escape from them all. There were reports that she began wandering alone after dark, walking to the edge of the forest, standing for hours in the moonlight, muttering to herself. Some said she spoke to spirits, others that she cursed her fate aloud, calling down punishment on the men who had chained her. Fear began to spread through the village that she carried something dangerous inside her now. Not madness, but power, the kind of power born when a woman is stripped of everything, yet refuses to die. The brothers, sensing it, grew more paranoid, each watching her as though she were both their prisoner and their executioner. And in truth, she had become both, for she now carried within her the only weapon tradition could never predict, the will to destroy what it had built. By now, the wife was no longer just a prisoner of tradition. She was a mirror, reflecting the rot that had always lived beneath the surface of the custom itself. In the village, people began speaking of her in hushed tones. Children were warned not to stare too long at her when she walked by, lest her curse cling to them. Women both pitied and feared her, whispering that she had endured what none of them could survive. Men avoided her altogether, uneasy in her presence, as if sensing she carried truths no man wished to face. Inside the house, the brothers had descended into a paranoia so consuming that even their meals were poisoned with suspicion. Each refused to eat first. Each demanded the wife taste the food before them, not realizing that in forcing her to swallow danger, they revealed the depth of their fear. The youngest clung to her like a lover desperate for salvation, his eyes wild, his words tumbling in half-confessions. The second spoke less, but his silence was heavy with plans, his gaze cold and calculating, like a man who had chosen patience as his weapon. The eldest barked commands, but his voice cracked, his authority slipping through his fingers as his body withered from drink and rage. The children, caught in the crossfire of suspicion, became fractured beings, some clinging to their mothers' skirts, others mirroring their father's cruelty, already repeating the cycle of dominance and silence. And still, the wife remained calm. Witnesses claimed that when she appeared in public, she carried herself with an almost regal bearing, her silence transforming into something closer to sovereignty. Some villagers whispered that she had mastered her suffering, turning it into power, the way iron is forged in fire. Others feared that she had gone beyond humanity altogether, becoming something untouchable, something that belonged not to this world but to the darker corners of it. The institutions could no longer ignore the whispers, but they chose to suppress them, warning people not to speak of curses, insisting that everything unfolding was merely family matters. Yet this is how systems protect themselves, not by solving corruption, but by silencing those who point it out. And so the wife's power grew, not because she sought it, but because silence gave it room to breathe. The three brothers had chained her to preserve their wealth, but now it was she who held the chains and she had learned how to tighten them. The descent into ruin accelerated when sickness entered the household. At first it was smaller fever that struck the eldest, leaving him weak and trembling. But soon the others began to suffer too. The second coughed blood into his hands. The youngest grew pale and restless, muttering in feverish dreams. Neighbors whispered that it was no ordinary illness. Some said the house itself was cursed, the walls poisoned by years of violence. Others claimed the wife had finally turned her suffering into vengeance, feeding them slowly with herbs that withered their strength. None could prove it, but all believed it. The wife did nothing to dispel the rumors. When the brothers demanded answers, she looked at them with cold, steady eyes and said nothing. That silence gnawed at them worse than the sickness itself. Fear twisted into madness. The eldest accused the second of plotting with her, claiming the illness was a conspiracy to steal his inheritance. The second, weak but defiant, spat back that the eldest had already lost everything, that the wife would never obey him again. The youngest, burning with fever, clung to her desperately, whispering that he would follow her even into death. Their arguments turned savage, their bodies too frail to strike, but their tongues sharper than knives. And always, the wife remained unmoved. She tended the children, kept the fire burning, and walked through the house like an executioner waiting for the hour of judgment. Outside, the villagers avoided the property, swearing that strange noises echoed at night, chanting, cries, and sometimes laughter that didn't sound human. They warned each other that stepping too close meant carrying the curse back into their own homes. Even priests refused to intervene, sending only token blessings from afar, unwilling to cross the threshold. Institutions that had once defended this family's arrangement now recoiled in silence, as though the system itself was ashamed of the monster it had created. But this was no shame, it was strategy. To abandon the cursed family was to erase them from history, to pretend the system had never demanded such sacrifices. And so the house became isolated, a living tomb. The wealth they had preserved lay untouched, the land fertile and ready, but none of it mattered. What good is land when the blood that claims it is poisoned? What good is wealth when it buys only silence? In their obsession to keep everything whole, the three brothers had broken everything beyond repair. The illness did not kill them quickly. It stretched on, slow and merciless, eating away its strength and sanity. The brothers grew skeletal, their voices hoarse, their eyes sunken with paranoia. Hunger gnawed at them as fields went untended, livestock wandered, and the pantry thinned to nothing. Yet none dared leave the wife's side, for fear that while one was gone, another would claim what remained of her loyalty. Starvation became another weapon in the war inside that house. They accused one another of stealing food in the night, though all knew the truth that she controlled every morsel, handing out pieces of bread so small they seemed more insult than sustenance. It was her judgment, her punishment, her power finally revealed in the clearest form, and yet the brothers could not rebel. They were too weak, too bound by the very system they had created. Their pride would not allow them to break the pact of shared possession, even as it destroyed them. So they withered, trapped in the prison of their own making. The wife, however, remained strangely untouched. While the men wasted away, her body seemed to grow stronger, her eyes sharper, her presence more commanding. The villagers who dared spy from a distance swore she looked ageless, like something ancient wearing the form of a woman. Fear deepened, rumors spreading that she had made a pact with something unholy, trading the lives of her husbands for a strength no ordinary human could hold. By now the house was no longer just a dwelling, it was a stage, a living legend of suffering and betrayal. People spoke of shadows moving in windows long after the lamps had gone dark, and of cries that echoed into the valley though no mouth could be seen to utter them. Institutions remained silent, church and law alike turning their backs. They had designed the rules that birthed this arrangement, yet now they denied its existence, hiding their hands from the blood dripping in plain sight. This was the cost of their corruption. Suffering erased, truth buried. Lives written out of history because they no longer served wealth or control. But within that silence, something else began to grow. The wife's children, no longer fragile infants, were watching. They were learning. They saw the sickness of their fathers, the cruelty of their mother, the abandonment of the village, and the cowardice of the institutions that once ruled them. They were inheriting not wealth, but a lesson carved in suffering, the kind of lesson that never dies, the kind that breeds darker generations. The children grew up inside a world where lies were truth and cruelty was law. They never knew affection, only the shifting tones of power mothers' cold commands, fathers' weakened rants, and the ceaseless whispers of suspicion that slithered through every corner of the house. By night, they lay awake listening to the rasping coughs of their fathers, each one weaker than the last, each one clinging to life like a candle in a draught. The children learned early that survival meant silence. Speaking the wrong word could spark fury. Showing weakness could invite punishment. And yet, in silence, they learned to see everything. They watched how their mother's eyes lingered on the strong, how her hand withheld from the weak, how she seemed to choose who would endure another day and who would wither. In time, they stopped thinking of the three men as fathers at all. They were shadows, decaying figures of authority stripped bare by sickness and rivalry. What mattered was the woman at the center, the architect, the manipulator, the one who bent them all to her will. To the villagers, this brood was cursed. They whispered that the children's eyes glowed unnaturally in moonlight, that their laughter sounded hollow, rehearsed, like echoes of someone else's voice. They said the curse of the brothers had been passed into their blood, a legacy of greed, betrayal, and unnatural union. Yet no priest came to bless the house, no healer came to drive out evil. The institutions that once claimed to protect the people had abandoned them, for their involvement would mean acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would mean guilt. This silence was not innocence, it was complicity. And so, the children of the pact grew into something other, something no longer tethered to the village's values or the illusions of faith. They carried the knowledge of their parents' designer system that sacrificed love for wealth, family for power, flesh for inheritance. And they swore, whether in whispers to themselves or in silence of thought, that they would never be victims of such control again. But their oath was not born of virtue. It was born of rage, of betrayal, of a childhood marinated in shadows. They would become not a warning, but a weapon, the living embodiment of the curse that began when 3 brothers chose to chain one woman to their pride. The story was no longer about wealth or land. It was about legacy, and the legacy was blood. The first true fracture came when the eldest son, now nearly a man, looked into the eyes of his dying father and saw nothing but ruin. The man who had once commanded fields, cattle, and respect was reduced to trembling hands and vacant stares, his body eroded by disease and years of bitterness. The boy asked a question no child should ever have to form. If this is what loyalty and sacrifice bring, why cling to it? That question festered, and in silence, it hardened into resolve. The brothers who were his fathers were fading one by one, but their laws still ruled the household laws, written in secrecy and enforced through fear. To the eldest son, those rules were shackles, forged not for survival, but for control. He saw through them, through the lies that justified his mother's authority, through the whispers that claimed this life was fate. It wasn't fate, it was design, and he would not be trapped by it. The boy began to test the edges of his cage. He kept secrets from his mother. He refused small commands. He studied her closely, noticing how she tightened her grip on the younger children whenever rebellion stirred, how she wielded love and cruelty with surgical precision. But he was no longer afraid. He had learned something she never expected. Her control worked only in silence. If he spoke, if he shattered the unspoken pact, if he revealed the truth to the village in the right way, her power would collapse. But revelation alone was not enough. He needed more proof evidence of the corruption that birthed them, of the crimes hidden behind their walls. And so, in the dead of night, he searched. He found letters hidden in a chest beneath rotting blankets, papers detailing the division of property, signed in 3 names, each one binding the woman to her role, each one declaring she would bear sons to continue the bloodline, not out of love, but out of law. He stared at those papers and felt something dark awaken inside him. It was not sorrow, it was not pity, it was fury. He realized then that he was not just a child of betrayal, he was its weapon. And weapons are not meant to remain silent. For the first time in the cursed family story, defiance was born, and it would not remain a whisper. Defiance in such a house was not a small ripple. It was a storm tearing at walls already weakened by secrets. The eldest son, emboldened by the papers he found, no longer bowed his head when his mother's voice struck like a whip. He no longer sat silently when the younger ones were forced to obey absurd rituals of obedience, demanded to repeat the same rehearsed lines about honor and loyalty. His silence was gone, replaced with questions, sharp, dangerous questions that clawed at the very foundation of their existence. "Why were we born into lies?" he asked her one evening, as the lamps flickered and the younger children sat. Frozen in fear, she slapped him, but her hand trembled. The authority she wielded so effortlessly for years was cracking, and he knew it. Every act of rebellion widened the fracture. The younger children began to watch him differently, their terror mixed with a flicker of something dangerous, hope. Hope that there was another way to live. The brothers, his uncles, his fathers, were too weak to intervene. Their bodies were wasting, their voices a faint echo of what once commanded the household. They depended on her to enforce the order, but her control was slipping through her fingers like sand. At night, she prayed louder than before, as if begging unseen forces to restore the order that had protected her power. But the eldest son was beyond prayers. He carried the documents with him, hidden in a pocket near his chest, as though they were both shield and sword. He began speaking to people in the village, carefully, indirectly. He hinted at the truth of his birth. He planted seeds of suspicion. And when those villagers looked at his mother afterward, their eyes carried something new. Doubt. To a woman who had survived on secrecy, doubt was poison. She grew harsher, more violent, her punishments crueler. But cruelty could no longer erase what had begun. The household was now a battlefield, the son against the mother, silence against revelation, control against freedom. In those walls, every meal became a standoff, every night a war, and behind it all, one truth loomed. Her empire of lies could not endure forever. Something had to give, and when it did, it would not be gentle. The first crack in the wall of secrecy came not from a confrontation, but from a whisper carried beyond the gates. The eldest son, weary of silence, let slip fragments of truth to a trusted friend at least. He thought he could trust him. But secrets are heavy, and when passed to another man, they demand release, like a burning coal that must be dropped before it scorches the hand. Within days, the whispers spread through the village like smoke rising from an unseen fire. 3 brothers, 1 wife. The children don't even know who their father is. Wealth kept intact by sin. At first, the villagers spoke, in hushed tones, lowering their voices when the family passed by. But soon the whispers turned into glances, the glances into mocking smirks, and the smirks into loud, biting remarks. The matriarch felt it before she heard it. The women she had once dominated in the market no longer bowed their heads. The men she had intimidated no longer averted their gaze. Respect, her currency of control, was vanishing. She lashed out in rage, dragging her son by the arm, locking him in a room for days, starving him of food and light. But it was too late. The village had tasted scandal, and scandal was blood in the water. The brothers, frail and defeated, begged her to act. "Silence them," they said, "before they destroy us." But how does one silence a village? She tried with threats, with bribes, with tears. Yet the more she denied, the more the whispers grew. The eldest son, released from confinement, bore the bruises of his defiance like badges of honor. He walked through the streets unbroken, and the villagers began to look at him not as a bastard, but as a martyr to a hidden truth. The power she once held was dissolving, her empire of silence turning to dust before her eyes. And worse, the authorities, those she thought blind, were beginning to listen. Rumors had reached the ears of officials in the district. A family that broke the natural order, that defied both law and morality, was now under watch. The walls of her fortress, built on shame and secrecy, were collapsing. But she was not ready to surrender. No, she would rather destroy everything than allow her legacy to be dismantled in the open air. The knock came at dawn. Not a polite tap, but a pounding, firm, deliberate, and cold, the kind of sound that signals the end of hiding. The brothers froze. The wife gripped her shawl tighter, as though fabric could shield her from judgment. The matriarch stood tall, her face pale but resolute, as she opened the door to the district officers. They entered without invitation, their boots heavy. On the earthen floor, their eyes scanning the home like hunters entering a den. They carried no warmth, only the weight of authority and suspicion. "We've heard things," one of them said flatly. "Strange arrangements, children without fathers, a household that defies law and reason." The matriarch denied everything, her voice calm but laced with venom. "Lies," she spat, "spoken by jealous villagers who envy our unity, our wealth." But the officers weren't listening for truth, they were measuring fear. They saw it in the brothers' eyes, in the wife's trembling hands, in the way the children clung to the shadows, confused and afraid. The questions came like blows. Who fathered which child? Why had the land never been divided? Why did the wife refuse to speak when addressed? Each silence was damning, each evasive glance a confession. The matriarch countered with half-truths and deflections, her tongue sharp, as ever, but the officers had already smelled rot beneath the surface. They left without arrests, but their presence was a wound. The village gathered outside, watching, whispering louder than ever. The family's house, once a fortress of fear, now looked like a cage. For the first time, power was not in their hands. The brothers argued in the dark that night, voices raised, blame hurled like stones. The wife wept silently, her tears soaking the floor, and the matriarch, for all her iron will, felt a chill she had not known before, the cold hand of inevitability pressing on her throat. Once the authorities circle, there is no escape. A decision had to be made. She would not let them dismantle her empire. If the truth threatened to escape, she would bury it in blood and silence. And so, plans began to form in the shadows of that cursed home, plans that would forever mark the family not as victims of scandal, but as architects of something darker, something unspeakable. The matriarch did not sleep that night. She sat upright in her wooden chair, eyes fixed on the glowing embers in the hearth, her face etched with lines of calculation and fury. Outside, the wind clawed at the shutters, rattling them like the heartbeat of an omen. She knew the danger was no longer whispers, it was official, stamped with authority, carried by men who could strip her family of everything. And so, she made a decision. If truth is the threat, she murmured to herself, then truth must die. Her voice was low, but the brothers heard it. They stood behind her like shadows, uncertain, restless, their loyalty bound by fear as much as blood. The wife trembled when the matriarch's eyes turned to her, for she understood before a word was spoken. Silence was no longer enough. They had to erase doubt, crush rumors, and instill terror so deep that no one in the village or beyond dare question them again. A chilling plan unfolded. One brother was tasked with finding those who had spoken too freely in the marketplace. Another was to ensure that evidence, family records, secret letters, even a child's whispered questions would be burned before daylight. And the third was given the darkest task of all, to silence a villager permanently, make an example. so brutal that fear would choke the tongue of anyone who dared to gossip again. The wife, too, was bound to this conspiracy, though unwillingly. The matriarch whispered threats in her ear. If you falter, it will not be the villagers who suffer, but your own children. Remember that. The weight of that threat crushed her spirit. By dawn, their plan was set. What had begun as a scandal was now mutating into a conspiracy, a blood pact not of love, but of survival. The family was no longer merely hiding a forbidden union, they were preparing to kill for it. And in the village below, as the sun rose, no one could have guessed that the next days would bring not resolution but a spiral into violence, corruption, and the kind of horror that becomes legend. The family's descent was no longer quiet. It was sharpening into something irreversible. The chosen night was heavy, air thick with silence, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant bark of a stray dog, the brother assigned to carry. Out, the matriarch's darkest command walked alone down the narrow path that led to the edge of the village. In his hand, he carried a tool disguised as necessity, a farming sickle, sharpened to a glint under the moonlight. His steps were measured, but his breathing betrayed him, ragged and shallow. The target was a villager named Haran, a simple man who had spoken to freely, whose careless words in the marketplace had carried like wildfire. He had joked about the wife, called her a woman with 3 shadows, a remark that made strangers lean in closer, eager for gossip. It was enough to mark him for death. The brother found Haran outside his hut, chopping wood, unaware that death was approaching from behind. There was no warning, no words exchanged, only the sudden sweep of the sickle across flesh. A sound cut through the night, half scream, half gasp, then silence. Haran's body slumped into the dirt, blood seeping into the earth like ink on a page that could never be erased. The brother stood frozen, hands trembling, the reality of murder clawing at his mind. But he forced himself to drag the body into the forest, covering the trail with branches and stones. By dawn, Haran was gone, swallowed by the soil. The villagers awoke to his absence. Confusion first, then whispers, then fear. Some said he had left in the night, others claimed bandits had taken him. But a few knew those who had heard his remark about the brothers and their wife, and they understood the message without it being spoken. Their laughter died in their throats, their tongues grew heavy, their eyes averted whenever the family passed. The matriarch watched all this from the shadows of her window, a grim satisfaction in her eyes. She knew that blood was the language of power, and now the village spoke it fluently. But the wife did not share in this dark triumph. She wept quietly, unseen, for she knew that one act of violence never ends with one. Murder has a way of multiplying, of feeding upon itself until it devours everything. And she feared that this was only the beginning of a chain of horrors that would consume them all. The disappearance of Haran spread beyond the village faster than the family had anticipated. His relatives, suspicious of his sudden vanishing, traveled from a neighboring settlement to demand answers. They knocked on doors, questioned neighbors, and stirred up what the brothers had tried to bury. Rumors whispered in shadows grew louder, now tinged with fear and accusation. Some claimed Haran had offended the wrong people. Others suggested he stumbled upon a secret not meant to be known. The brothers watched this storm gather like men standing at the edge of a cliff, every gust of suspicion threatening to push them over. Their mother, cold and commanding, told them to remain silent, to never admit, to never falter. But silence is rarely a shield, it is an echo chamber that amplifies guilt. The wife, increasingly trapped, began to notice how eyes lingered on her whenever she walked through the marketplace. Women avoided her touch, men whispered when she passed, and children stared with a mix of fear and curiosity. It was as though her very body carried the weight of sin, as if the village could sense the blood her family had spilled. The paranoia that seeped into the brothers' minds was not unfounded. A traveling official from the nearest town had arrived. Alerted by Haran's relatives, he carried himself with authority, his presence a reminder that law existed beyond the village's dirt roads and whispered traditions. He asked questions the brothers couldn't easily answer. Why did no one hear Haran leave? Why were there marks near the forest path resembling something dragged? Why did the wife look so pale, so haunted, as if she bore a truth too heavy for her frame? The brothers closed ranks, their answers rehearsed, their faces stone, but cracks appeared. One brother, younger and less disciplined, trembled under questioning. Another grew hostile, deflecting with anger. The official noted it all. That night, as the family sat together in the dim glow of an oil lamp, the wife finally spoke the words they all feared. They know. The silence that followed was suffocating, each breath sharp and jagged. Their mother leaned forward, her voice cutting like a blade. Then we must give them something else to fear. We must remind them that this family cannot be touched. Her words were a curse and a promise. For the brothers, it meant more blood, more shadows. For the wife, it meant a descent into a nightmare from which there was no return. The family's strategy shifted from secrecy to domination. If whispers could not be silenced with denial, they would be drowned out with fear. That very night, under the command of their mother, the brothers gathered tools not for farming but for spectacle torches, ropes, blades. The wife watched in horror as the three men, bound by blood and guilt, transformed themselves into figures meant to haunt. They set fire to a small shed on the edge of the village, an empty structure, but its flames licked the night sky like a warning. The crackle of burning wood was accompanied by guttural shouts, threats hurled into the darkness. Let any who question us remember silence is survival. The villagers, drawn from their homes, stood in clusters, trembling under the glow of destruction. No one dared speak. The message was clear. This family was dangerous, untouchable. Fear would keep them safe where lies could not. But fear is a double-edged weapon. It cuts outward into the world, but always turns inward, slicing into the soul. Of those who wield it, the wife felt it most. She could not escape the image of Haran's last stare, nor the stench of smoke that now clung to her hair and skin. She lay awake each night beside men who shared her body but offered her no sanctuary. The mother watched her closely, like a hawk circling prey, making sure her lips never loosened, her eyes never betrayed. The villagers, though cowed, were not blind. They spoke softly, behind closed doors, about the sickness spreading through that household. Some whispered that curses had been invited in, that the ancestors themselves were restless. Others swore. They had seen shadows moving in the fields when the brothers were elsewhere, shapes too tall, too twisted to belong to men. The official from the town did not leave. He lingered, observing, writing. His presence unsettled the brothers, who began to suspect that their stage terror had only deepened his interest. He asked again about Haran. He asked about the fires. And this time, he looked not at the brothers, but at the wife, his gaze steady, probing, as if he could see the truth locked behind her trembling silence. That night, she wept quietly, knowing that the brothers were not finished, and neither was the darkness that followed them. Fear had bought them time, but time always runs out. The wife's mind became a battlefield. Every corner of her soul was haunted by conflicting terrors. The wrath of the brothers, the watchful eye of their mother, and the piercing suspicion of the outsider official. She felt like a prisoner of her own silence, each day a performance of obedience and endurance. When she walked to the well, she carried water but also carried the weight of invisible chains. When she served food, her hands trembled as though every plate was an offering to her captors. Her body belonged to 3 men, but her spirit belonged nowhere. At night, when the brothers slept in drunken exhaustion, she pressed her palm against her mouth to muffle the sobs, fearing the mother might hear even her grief and twist it into betrayal. The official's presence had become unbearable. He lingered in the fields, asked the villagers discreet questions, and once, he even followed her when she went to fetch herbs. His footsteps behind her felt like a shadow pulling at the truth. She buried inside, yet in his eyes she saw no malice only, a quiet insistence, an unyielding hunger for clarity, and that terrified her more than threats, for clarity meant exposure, and exposure meant death. The brothers grew restless. They accused one another of being careless, of speaking too much, of drinking too heavily when eyes were on them. The eldest struck the second one night, splitting his lip, while the youngest threatened to run. Their unity, their power was fraying. The mother, cold and sharp, pulled them back together with words like knives. If one of you falls, you all fall. Do you understand? Her voice was iron, her will the cage that kept them locked in their unholy pact. The villagers, meanwhile, began their own quiet rebellion, not with weapons, but with silence. No one visited the brothers' home. No one shared food. No one exchanged greetings. The family became an island surrounded by suspicion. Isolation pressed on the wife most of all. She began seeing Haran's face in reflections on water, in mirrors, in windows. His dead eyes followed her, accusing, reminding. Some nights, she thought she heard his voice whispering through the cracks in the walls. She couldn't tell if it was grief, madness, or something more. Perhaps the curse was real. Perhaps silence had summoned it. And as the official's gaze lingered longer, she realized she stood at the breaking point. If she did not choose, soon the truth would choose her. The confrontation came on a night when the air itself seemed heavy with dread, as though the village held its breath. The official stood waiting near the well, his figure cloaked in shadow, his presence impossible to ignore. The wife approached, her footsteps slow, her heart pounding like war drums. She wanted to turn back, but his voice, low, steady, commanding, cut through the silence. You cannot live like this forever. She froze, her throat closing around the words she longed to speak but dared not release. His eyes locked onto hers, not with accusation, but with certainty. He already knew. He didn't need her confession, yet he demanded it for her sake, for the dead man, for the balance of the village that was unraveling like a rope fraying at both ends. He stepped closer. I know about the land. I know about your husband. And I know the brothers will not stop until everything and everyone is destroyed. She trembled, her lips parting, but fear strangled her tongue. To speak was death, but so was silence. The official's hand brushed the edge of the well, his voice lowering to a whisper sharp enough to pierce the darkness. The truth is a weapon. If you hold it, it may free you. If you bury it, it will bury you. Tears welled in her eyes, not from weakness, but from the unbearable tension of being pulled between survival and justice. Behind her, she could almost feel the invisible eyes of the brothers watching from the shadows, waiting for the smallest sign of betrayal. She finally forced a sound past her lips, a name, broken, fragile, almost inaudible: Haran. The official nodded, his suspicion confirmed, but he did not press further. He knew she had reached the edge, and to push harder might send her into despair or into the arms of those who held her captive. He leaned closer, his words cutting straight into her spirit. The curse is not in the land. The curse is in the silence. Then he turned, leaving her alone with the echoes of her choice. The wife's knees buckled as she sank to the ground, the weight of what she had admitted crushing her. For the first time, the truth had left her lips, but only to the ears of a man who could destroy everything. Her secret was no longer hers to hold. And in that moment, she knew the brother's grip over her life had begun to slip. Though the danger had only just begun, the brothers sensed it almost instantly. Something in her eyes had shifted, a sliver of doubt piercing the mask she had worn so faithfully. They watched her with sharpened suspicion, each glance heavy with silent accusation. At first it was small, almost imperceptible. The way she avoided their touch, the way her answers grew shorter, the way her gaze lingered on the horizon as if she was searching for an escape. But in a family where trust was already poisoned by greed, these small fractures were enough to ignite paranoia. Haran, the eldest, was the first to voice it. "She knows something," he whispered to his younger brothers, his face hard and unyielding. "And she's hiding it." The others, already restless, latched onto his words like dogs scenting blood. That night, their whispers became arguments. Arguments became accusations, and accusations turned to violent outbursts. Furniture shook, walls trembled, and the wife sat silent in the corner, her hands gripping her dress so tightly her knuckles whitened. She knew the storm was coming, and that she was the lightning rod. The youngest brother, whose eyes always betrayed weakness, finally turned on her directly. "Who were you with near the well?" he demanded, his voice cracking, his suspicion naked. Her breath caught in her throat, but before she could speak, Haran silenced him with a glare. "No," he growled. "Let her answer when she chooses." But it wasn't mercy, it was strategy. He wanted her fear to ripen, to push her into revealing truths without force. Yet the second brother, more brutal, less patient, slammed his hand against the table, sending a clay cup shattering across the floor. "We bleed for this land, and she dares hide from us. She thinks we don't see." The room thickened with menace, the shadows of the firelight stretching their faces into monstrous reflections of their inner rage. The wife's chest tightened as she realized the walls around her were closing in. They no longer saw her as their shared bond, their anchor. She was now a liability, a secret too dangerous to ignore. Haran's eyes lingered on her, cold and calculating, his silence louder than any threat. In that silence, she understood. The game was ending. Her confession to the official had set a chain of suspicion ablaze, and the brothers' hunger for control would soon devour her. What she didn't know was that they had already made a decision that would ensure her voice would never rise against them. The decision was not spoken aloud, at first it was carried in their eyes. A silent pact forged in the tension that bound them tighter than blood. Each brother knew what the other was thinking, yet none dared to say it plainly, as if uttering the words would summon the ghost of morality they had long since buried. But eventually, Haran, the one who always steered their fates, broke the silence. If she threatens the land, he said slowly, his voice deep and steady, then she threatens us all. And a threat must be cut at the root. The second brother clenched his fists, pacing the floor like a caged beast. We can't let her talk. Not to the villagers, not to the officials, not to anyone. If they know our wealth rests on her, silence, they will turn us into beggars overnight. His voice trembled with both rage and fear. The youngest, who still carried traces of doubt in his gaze, faltered. But she's our wife, he muttered, his words dissolving in the air as Harren's glare fell upon him. No, Harren corrected sharply, she was our wife. Now she is our enemy. And enemies, no matter how familiar, must be dealt with. The room grew colder, as though the night itself recoiled from their intentions. Outside, the wind rattled the wooden shutters like skeletal fingers warning against the sin about to be committed. Yet inside, greed and paranoia eclipsed every shadow of hesitation. They began to plot with chilling precision, speaking in hushed tones about timing, about places hidden from prying eyes, about stories they could tell if anyone asked where she had gone. She must vanish without a trace, Harren instructed. No blood, no body, no suspicion. She leaves quietly, as if she never existed. The land stays in our name. The wealth remains intact. That is how it must be. The younger brother sat with his head in his hands, trembling, whispering prayers into his palms that no god seemed willing to hear. His heart wavered, but his silence condemned him. He did not resist, and that silence, that cowardly stillness, was all the permission the other two needed. As the fire burned low and the shadows deepened, their pact solidified into something irreversible. She was no longer their wife, she was their problem. And problems, in a house built on forbidden unity, were not allowed to live. The night they chose was moonless, as though the heavens themselves had conspired to hide the deed. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional howl of a distant dog that seemed to sense what was about to happen. She lay in the small wooden room, exhausted from days of tension, her mind restless with thoughts of escape. Her breaths came unevenly, as if her soul already sensed the danger pressing closer. The door creaked open not once, but thrice as each brother stepped in, their shadows stretching across the walls like executioners. Harren carried a length of rope coiled in his hands, its fibers frayed and stained by years of labor, now repurposed for betrayal. The second brother's grip tightened around an iron tool, its dull edge gleaming faintly. The youngest entered last, his hands empty, his eyes wet with the terror of a man watching morality dissolve. She rose, startled, whispering their names, as though invoking them could summon the love they once swore to her. But no answer came, only silence. Harren spoke first, his tone flat, rehearsed. You were meant to keep us united. Instead, you divided us, and for that, he raised the rope, advancing with steady steps. Panic seized Hershey, backed away, her fingers clawing at the wooden wall as if she could tear through it to freedom. Her screams filled the room, sharp and haunting, yet the walls trapped every sound. The second brother lunged forward, pressing her down with brute force, his face twisted in rage and despair. Forgive us, the youngest whispered, though his voice carried no conviction. In those final moments, she struggled with the fury of someone who knows death is not fate but theft. Her nails scraped skin, her knees struck flesh, yet they overpowered her, binding her resistance with cruel efficiency. Her cries faltered, then stilled, leaving behind only the labored breaths of the men who had once sworn to protect her. When it was done, The brothers stood in the darkness, trembling. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream, a silence that seemed to curse the air itself. Her body lay limp, her presence extinguished, yet the room felt more crowded than ever, haunted by the ghost of a woman who had been wife, prisoner, and sacrifice all at once. And though they had ended her life, they had not ended her power. In killing her, they had invited something far darker to claim them. The deed was done. But the silence that followed was not peace, it was judgment. The brothers thought that by erasing her, they would erase the threat to their unity, to their wealth, to the fragile balance of their shared life. But the air around them thickened with a weight they could not name. Her absence did not dissolve the tension, it magnified it. Each man looked at the other, and in their eyes flickered the truth. They were no longer brothers bound by blood, but murderers bound by guilt. They buried her beneath the earth, far from the village paths, pressing the soil down as though it could muffle the truth. Yet every dawn, when the rooster crowed, they swore they heard her voice in the wind, whispering their names. The youngest began to wither first. He stopped speaking at meals, his eyes fixed on the corner of the room where she once sat. He muttered apologies under his breath, sometimes screaming them into the night. Heron, the eldest, clung to control, insisting all was well. Yet his hands trembled whenever he touched the rope that now hung hidden in the barn, a relic of betrayal. The second brother turned to drink, but the more he drank, the louder her presence became, until he smashed bottles against the wall in futile attempts to silence her. The village noticed. Whispers spread. Why had she vanished? Where had she gone? Their story faltered under the weight of prying eyes. Rumors bred like vermin. Some said she had fled with another man, others that the gods had cursed the family for their unnatural marriage. But one elder spoke with chilling certainty. A wife shared is a spirit chained. Break the chain, and the spirit will haunt its keepers, and haunt them she did. The farm rotted from within, animals dying without reason, crops withering before harvest. Visitors avoided the house, claiming the air felt wrong, heavy with an unseen hand pressing against the chest. At night, the brothers could not sleep. Dreams showed her face, sometimes loving, sometimes vengeful, but always present. Their wealth remained intact, but it became meaningless, for no gold can silence the voice of the dead. They had sought to prevent division, but in her death, she became the eternal wedge between them, a curse carved into their very souls. And so the tale of the three brothers and one wife was not a story of wealth preserved, but of blood tainted and legacy destroyed. For in trying to control fate, they unleashed a force they could never master. Remember this: forbidden bonds always demand payment, and when men try to own what cannot be owned, history itself will record their ruin.